Brad was saying that, am I on the monitors? I feel like I'm in an echo chamber. Thank you. Brad was saying that sometimes there's good and bad about not having a pastor, and I think what I heard was the bad is that, the good is that sometimes we get to have special music, some other things to fill the program. The bad is you have to listen to people that aren't professional speakers. But I'm going to tie this together with the worship survey. Please fill out the worship survey, because I know for a fact that one thing the worship survey has always said since Martin Luther was a boy is that church must end at 12:30. Must end at 12:30. The rest, do your best, land the plane, get off the stage. It's going to rain, big storm coming in. Pathfinders, you're used to it, so you can go stand outside. The rest of us will stay in here. There's no possible way I was sitting in the back scratching stuff off of my notes today. As a matter of fact, I think my entire second page I've now scratched off. There's no way I can really keep you from feeling hungry while I talk and feeling like we're already late in the day. But I do want to, I've been wanting to talk for a while about Ecclesiastes. And by the way, before I even get into it, how many of you watched the live streams in the evenings for Believe the Promise? Okay, only a handful of you. Go back and watch them. Followed Pastor Damian Chandler. Cindy showed a little bit of the clip of the last night. Man, he landed it. It was really worth seeing. That guy is headed off to Nashville. He didn't grow up in Adventist. He converted, and he's headed off to Nashville to start a new church. And it's going to be one of these, throw out the book and see if you can start something from scratch that just makes sense as you go. And I look forward to visiting his church someday. But today, as I was going through Ecclesiastes, one of the beauties of actually having to talk to you guys is that it forces you, and I'm going to recommend this, all of you, take a sermon date, every one of you, because it forces you, whatever you're going to talk about, to spend a lot of time with it, a lot of time with it. And I think I've read Ecclesiastes probably 40 times in the last 3 or 4 weeks. And as I did, this turned into a one sermon quick hit into 4, and now today it's going to go to 5, which means probably we'll get 1 and the rest will never get spoken, because if I stand up here the next time and say, remember last time when we were talking about Ecclesiastes, you're going to go, dude, I don't even remember your name, much less what you talked about last time. So, but we're going to get started with this, because I was literally listening to somebody talk. I think it was John Piper, Bethel Baptist. Somebody was doing an interview with him about why is Ecclesiastes even in the Bible. They were going through a number of books, right? This whole is, if the Bible is inspired, how did this book get there? It just doesn't seem to fit. And John Piper was talking about, what inspiration means and what it doesn't mean, and sometimes we overinterpret the word inspiration. But one of the things he did say, he said, if I am ever connected to somebody who is very secular, they have had no spiritual upbringing whatsoever, and they think God is completely irrelevant to them, I start with Ecclesiastes. Because Ecclesiastes is relevant to every human being that has ever lived. And as I read this, as I studied it, I kind of read it with that context. And I want to create a little bit of context for this first, some of which you may know and some of which you don't. I almost guarantee you know that Solomon wrote it, right? You got that. Well, I want to tell you a little bit about Solomon to create some context. So Solomon probably became king of Israel before he was 20. He was fairly young. He was depending on how you read one particular passage of the Bible, King David's youngest son. He's either the fourth youngest or the youngest. And he wasn't supposed to be king, except that the prophet Nathan said he's going to be the king. Otherwise, somebody else, there were a whole bunch of brothers way ahead of him that were supposed to be the king. And when he became king, David had to rush him to the throne while he was still alive because the oldest son of David had proclaimed himself the king. So here's Solomon, 15 years old, somewhere between 15 and 20, being rushed to the throne by Nathan the prophet of God, by a priest, by David himself, by his mother Bathsheba. He's being rushed to the throne. And he served with David as king together for about 4 years. And during those 4 years, David basically structured the job for him. It talks about how David was, when he was king, the only thing he had was a general and a couple advisors. But when he, immediately after he proclaimed Solomon to be the king, he structured the entire kingdom, setting up councils and layers of advisors and things like that, laying out the plans for the temple, helping to secure all of the supplies to build the temple, basically putting the whole thing on rails. And somewhere about the time when everything's on rails and they start building the temple, David dies. And 7 years later, Solomon has completed the temple. He's a king in his own right. He's about 30 years old. And we get introduced to Solomon as a person when he prays to dedicate the temple. Up until then, he's just almost just the guy that is going to be the king. By the way, he died young, about 55 or 60 years old. But I want to tell you about his time as a king. I would read to you 1 Kings chapter 4, except 1 Kings chapter 4 is Jeremiah writing down the history many years later, about almost 300 and some years later. So it'd be like somebody today reaching back in time and grabbing paper records of Martin Luther and writing his story. But I want to tell it to you the way it probably got told for generations before that, kind of almost like, Daddy, tell me the story of Solomon. Well, I'm glad you asked. Solomon, man, one of the greatest ruler we have ever had. Let me tell you about the time when Solomon was the king. The people of Judah and Israel were so numerous that they numbered more than the sands of the seashore. You know, even more important with all those people, there it is. Okay, you guys, it's okay, you're inside this time. I know, Kai, it's scary, but even more important was the fact that we had all these people. They had plenty to eat and plenty to drink, and they were happy. Solomon at that time ruled over all the kingdoms from the great river to the north, which you've never seen, the Euphrates. He ruled all the land of Syria. He ruled all the way to the west, to the land of the Philistines. He ruled all the way to the south, to the borders of Egypt. The kingdom of Israel has never been so great. I got to tell you something, that all the kingdoms in that territory, this will be remarkable to you, all the kingdoms in that territory paid tribute to Solomon. Now, you're used to these days thinking that Israel paid tribute to everybody else because it was the weak nation. Then we were the strong nation. Everybody paid tribute to us. Let me tell you about the splendors of King Solomon's court. Every single day, I want to mention, Okay, day. Every single day, Solomon's court consumed 5 million pounds of flour. Every single day, they consumed 10 million pounds of unrefined grain. Every single day. Every single day, they consumed 10 fattened calves. Yes, they ate veal back then. They also consumed 20 more calves from the pasture, free range and organic. 100 sheep. Not to mention rams, gazelles, deer, and well-fed birds. His royal court was so large that he ruled over all the kingdoms at the same time from Jerusalem. And he was at peace with all his neighbors. He didn't have to conquer them. He was at peace. Better put the bucket out in the back. We know where the leaks are now. All the people of Israel and Judah had security. Everyone enjoyed the produce of their own vines and their own fig trees throughout Solomon's lifetime. Solomon had 4,000 stalls for his chariots. He had 12,000 horses. The district governors who acquired all the supplies for King Solomon and all who ate in his royal palace. There were so many. Every one of them was responsible for 1 month of the year. They made sure that no one lacked for anything. Each one brought to the assigned location his own quota from his territory of barley and straw to feed the horses. God gave Solomon, this is the most important thing, God gave Solomon wisdom and great discernment. The breadth of his understanding was as infinite as the sand on the seashore. Solomon was wiser than all the men of the East and all the wise men of Egypt. He was wiser than any man, including Ethan the Ezrahite. Go figure. Or he was wiser even than Heman and Calcol and Darda. You know who they are, the sons of Mahal. He was famous in all of the neighboring nations. He composed 3,000 proverbs and 1,005 songs. He produced textbooks on botany describing every kind of plant from the cedars of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the crack in the wall. He also produced manuals on biology, describing animals and birds and insects and fish. He was like the Audubon of his day, if Audubon was known. People from all nations came to hear Solomon's display of wisdom, and they came from all the kings of the earth who heard about his wisdom. Solomon was wealthier and wiser than any of the kings of earth. Everyone in the world wanted to visit Solomon to see him display his God-given wisdom. And year after year, visitors brought their gifts, including items of silver, gold, clothes, perfume, spices, horses, and mules. Do you know that when the Queen of Sheba came to visit Solomon, she brought him $400 million worth of gold? $400 million worth of gold. Now, admittedly, that's not the interest on the national debt in this country for more than a split second. But back then, $400 million worth of gold might have balanced the books. I don't know that Solomon had to worry about taxing, but if you wait till Sermon 5, you'll find out that he was really good at taxing. This is the story of Solomon. Successful at everything. His nation was successful at everything. I love the passage. It's kind of buried in there, but it gets used in the Old Testament a few times, that every citizen had the produce and they had their own vine and fig tree. In the Old Testament, in multiple places, that exact expression is used by God to describe his idea of the perfect life for his citizens. You have your own vine, you have your own fig tree. Somewhere in there, toward the end, Solomon wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. He's probably 50 to 55 years old, not too far away from dying. He might not know that, or he might. But Solomon clearly has a midlife crisis. Probably a sustained midlife crisis, and it has wrecked him. When you are Solomon and you have a midlife crisis, what in the world do you do to get out of it? How do you escape? When you have a barn with 4,000 chariots, each one in its stall, that's the equivalent of having 4,000 Corvettes. What do you do to make yourself happy if that's not enough? We'll get into the structure of Ecclesiastes and what he talks about and what he learns and his teachings in coming weeks. We don't have nearly enough time today. But suffice it to say that if you read Ecclesiastes 1 and 2, I'm going to boil down the essence of Ecclesiastes. Solomon says, I tried, I observed, and I learned everything, and it's all pointless. Because when you die, everything you own, everything you know, everything you did are gone. So it's all pointless. That's a midlife crisis. I mean, a midlife crisis today is a meme to us, right? It's almost a societal joke, right? You know, I'm going to try and pick an age that none of you are. Some dude of an undefined age shows up for church one day, you know, with a flashy sports car, his shirt unbuttoned down to here and a gold chain. I grew up in New Jersey, in case you couldn't tell. Suddenly got a whole new swagger, starts doing things and talking in ways that they didn't before, and you go, yeah, midlife crisis, midlife crisis. And as I went through this, I tried to go through, try to unpack Solomon and say what would cause him to have a midlife crisis. Because if Solomon can have a midlife crisis, if Solomon can say nothing in life is worth anything, then to be honest, if that's the gospel truth, it ain't worth anything to any of us either. If he had it right, we got it wrong. And this is what I came down to, and this is kind of the subtitle I gave to the sermon, which is midlife crises, I've decided, in Solomon's life and for humanity as a whole, happen when we look around and we realize that doors we counted on being open are closed, and they'll never be reopened. And we look ahead and we realize that all the doors we counted on being open ahead of us are also going to close. It's kind of to me, it's kind of the human condition that as you go through life, the definition of the human condition is doors close and they never reopen. Opportunities are passed. The blessing or the experience, the great thing, something great you expected to receive because you did something or had something didn't materialize. And you start realizing, if you're going to have a midlife crisis, you start realizing this is the way it's going to be all the way to the end. And it makes you doubt the path. I also called this Believe the Promise, Wait Which Promise, and I doubt we'll get to that part today, but that's kind of what a midlife crisis is. Everything I believed in, I'm not sure is right anymore. And I'm not sure what is right. So I have to, I'll give you an example of this. I have this 2-page list of all the doors in my life that have closed, and all the doors that I expect to close. And I don't have time to go through anywhere near them, but those of you who know me a little bit know that when I was young, I loved to play baseball. And I was absolutely certain I was going to be a professional baseball player. I played, the only thing, there were only 4 things I did when I was, young. Play baseball, go to school, try to avoid doing homework and practicing the piano, and try to avoid the chores in the garden my mom and dad gave me. Those are the things I did, but every second I had, I played baseball. Summer leagues, Babe Ruth League, everything. And you go through life thinking that you might actually be able to do this and enjoy it and make a profession out of it until you realize that you can't throw a 90-mile-an-hour fastball. That realization came early for me. But it's even worse when you realize you can't hit a 90-mile-an-hour fastball either. But you always think, and by the way, that had nothing to do with it for my parents. My parents said, you can't grow up to be a professional baseball player because you can't play baseball on Sabbath. Sandy Koufax proved that wrong. I always used to use Sandy Koufax with my mom and dad. I was like, Sandy Koufax didn't have to play on Sabbath. One time, when Sandy Koufax was supposed to pitch Game 1 of the World Series, it was going to fall on Yom Kippur. And he told the Dodgers, I'm not pitching on Yom Kippur. And they said, okay. And they let him take the day off. So I use that as, see, a good Seventh-day Adventist can observe the Sabbath. And if they're really good at baseball, they don't have to play on Sabbath, Friday night or Saturday. And you can believe the promise. You can hold on to that and say, yeah, this can happen to me until you're about 35. And then you start looking at all the players and you go, all right, there's almost nobody that can even play this game as a professional after 35. So I guess that door is closed to me. And you have to realize it. You just have to accept it. When I was in 8th grade, for some reason I gave a speech at my 8th grade graduation. I don't know why. I don't remember, but I do remember giving the speech. And I think my dad coached me to do this, Grandpa Ron, Maya. I think he coached me to do this on purpose because I was one of those kids that if you asked me what I wanted to be, I said an astronaut, a fireman. I want to build bridges. I want to, be an architect. I had all these things I wanted to be. And so my dad was like, well, you should work that into your speech. And so the only recollection I have of my 8th grade graduation speech is saying, somehow I worked it in that I wanted to be all these things, and the audience found it uproariously funny. I didn't know why. Why can't I be a fireman, an astronaut, an engineer, and an architect? I don't understand. I did understand about 6 years later when I registered to take linear algebra, and I had a pretty tough course load, and the first couple classes of linear algebra weren't that hard. They were a view of calculus, and I said, this class won't be too hard. I'm going to focus on foundations of biology. And about a week later, I realized I was going to have to drop linear algebra because I couldn't do it. I was going to fail. And there went engineering and a few other things off my list. Astronaut, definitely. Astronaut gone. Forget it. Doors close. Before I got married, I had, at one point, 5 motorcycles. And when I got married, it went down to 1. And when Natalie was born, it went to 0. Incompatible goals. Something I always loved. I love motorcycles. I love fast cars. Didn't fit anymore. Doors closed. Oh, I have a whole list. I was having lunch with, I'm looking into the future, I was having lunch with a friend of mine from work the day they announced the 2034 Olympics were coming to Salt Lake City. He said, Dave, where do you live? I said, I live in Park City. Is that close to Salt Lake City? I said, yeah, it's real close. He says, I'm coming to stay with you. And I said, dude, I don't even know if I'm going to be alive in 2034. That's a decade from now. You know, I don't know what the world's going to look like in 2034. A lot of doors might close for me between now and then. It's taken me a while to accept those things. Not because it was a big struggle, not because they were costly things to give up, but just because you definitely cross a divide. When you start saying, yeah, a lot of the things I thought were going to happen, there's just not enough time left. I don't have enough, I'm not smart enough, not strong enough. I was thinking about getting a new pair of custom fitted ski boots this year, but I don't know if I'm going to be skiing much longer. Shh. It was not okay with Solomon. To him, contemplating the futility of all the things he'd done in his life and envisioned in his life was not okay. To him, if life was going to turn out like that, it was going to be futile. A life not worth living. As a matter of fact, in I got to read this to you, and then I'll just have to cap it because it's 12:30. But the way Solomon says it in Ecclesiastes 2, and I'm reading it in a fairly liberal translation because it's impactful. Ecclesiastes 2, verse 11. Then I thought about everything I had done, including the hard work, and it was simply chasing the wind. Nothing on earth is worth the trouble. And in verse 20, I thought about all my hard work, and I felt depressed. I love liberal translations. I love modern translations. I felt depressed. It defined a futile life for Solomon, one not worth living. He gets all the way to the end and realizes that everything he's done to him was meaningless. It didn't mean a thing. What kind of life would it be for you? Are you wired differently than Solomon? I will tell you a couple things before we quit today, and I'm just going to have to wrap it. Kids. So this is for the kids. All you guys listen. Well, you know, kids that are of an age where this matters. If you haven't noticed, your parents, your mentors, your coaches, the people that surround you in life, the adults that surround you in life, are desperate to tell you, don't make hard and fast choices yet. Have you noticed that? You know, you're sitting there going, well, I think, you know, I've come to the point where I've got to make a career choice. I've got to choose this college degree versus that college degree. And as an adult, everything in me says, don't choose yet. You never know. Because once you choose, you close one door. And you'll very likely never come back to that door. So as adults, we want you young people, we want you to, all your horizons to be in front of you. Because we know, once you start making those choices, you don't go back. Solomon, here's the believe the promise part. Solomon had lost focus on the promise with a capital P. The promise was not what he thought it was. Somehow between when Solomon was 20 and when Solomon was 60, he decided that the promise from God was, you and your greatness will never die. You will be remembered forever. Everything you do will carry on. You will be the greatest there ever was. He thought that was the promise. And if you read, God did make the promise to Solomon. He says, if you follow in the ways of your father and you keep my commandments and you make good choices, I will make you the wisest man in the world. You will live a long life. There's a whole series of promises there, some of which didn't come true for Solomon because he didn't do the first part. He decided that it was all about him being the greatest and him never having to die, or the memory of him having to die, when in fact the promise from God always has been. The promise to David was very clear. The promise to Solomon was just the continuation, and it was, you will continue and further establish a kingdom that will glorify God. A kingdom that will be a salvation to all the nations. When 1 Kings 4 talks about how all the nations around came to see this wise philosopher king who had accumulated so much wealth and knowledge, that was a fulfillment of God's plan, that this kingdom was going to be the salvation of nations. And Solomon forgot about it. Solomon, I would argue, bought into the promise that Eve bought into. I'm going to reword what the serpent said to Eve, and I'm going to say it as if he was talking to Solomon. See if it makes sense. You and your accomplishments and your wealth and your notoriety and your wisdom will surely not die. You can aspire to be like God until you realize that you can't. So were you guys at the Friday night Believe the Promise? Were you at Friday night? Did you stay all the way till the end? All right. I love the way the final episode of the play ended, because the last scene, before the big musical extravaganza, of course, the last scene is Moses standing at the Red Sea with all his people behind them. And he's followed the cloud. God has led them to that point, and now the soldiers are all around them. Death is all around them. And the people are saying, why did you bring us out here to die? We all know this story. And I love the way they wrote the script for Believe the Promise. I love the way they wrote the script. Because what Moses says is, he basically says, we just have to believe the promise. We have followed God to this very spot. That's all that matters. We followed God to this very spot. What happens after this? What door opens? What door closes? That's up to God. I do not believe God would have led us here for something that wasn't going to glorify him. A way of rewriting that script to match the book of Ecclesiastes would be for Moses to say, this is the only door left open. And if God leaves us only one door, it is enough. It's not just enough, it's more than enough. Solomon, in the end, closed the book of Ecclesiastes with great pragmatism by saying, he basically almost acknowledges, I bought into this, a promise, and it was all wrong. And at the end, he basically says, so I have a conclusion, I guess. I don't like it much, but serve God, live a good life. It's all in his hands. Almost with a sigh. Oh, I hate to acknowledge that. I hate to admit that. You could tell by the way it's worded, he is not convinced, he doesn't like it. I'm not sure Solomon died in the arms of God. Not sure he did. But I will say that's the only option humanity has. You have an option where the last door you get to walk through is into the arms of God. Or the last door turns out to be closed and locked. The last door you thought you were going to walk through, or the last set of doors you thought you were going to walk through, don't mean anything. You get to choose. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we are grateful for the fantastic humanity that is in the Bible. It's hard for me not to fall in love with Solomon just because he's so real. He tells it like it is. I can relate to so much of it. To be honest, if all of us are honest with each other, we've had moments like that. Lord, thank you for promising that what we experience here on earth is not your plan. It is not the end. It is not going to end up in futility. Lord, as we delve more into the book of Ecclesiastes, help us to understand specifically how this can impact our lives. We all have these things that are just like Solomon. I ask that you would help us to understand what they are. You would help us to see in Solomon a direction we don't want to go. And help us to know the right way. I ask this in your name. Amen.